Hello and welcome to this session on language teaching methods, in which we are going to summarise the main language teaching methods and some related topics. So we're going to start today's session with a little pop quiz to see how much we know already about the topics of this session. Then we're going to talk about the differences between the terms approach, design and procedure, which, as we know, are all part of the so-called methods. Then we're going to start with the methods, talk about grammar translation and focus a little on deductive versus inductive teaching. We're going to talk about the natural method quickly, the direct method, situational language teaching, audiolingualism, and in particular we're going to focus a bit on the types of drills, as drills are the main type of activity used in audiolingualism. We're going to talk about a very important method, communicative language teaching, and in particular about the PPP structure: presentation, practice, production. We're going to move on to humanism in language teaching and talk about total physical response, the silent way, Suggestopedia, community language learning. Finally, we're going to move on to task-based language teaching, which is a key method still in use today. Mention the natural approach, move on to content and language integrated learning, CLIL, which, as we know, is quite important to the Italian educational system. And then finally, we're going to touch upon Dogme ELT and the flipped classroom. But to start with, let's have a little pop quiz to see how much we know, how much we remember perhaps about language teaching methods. So I'm going to go through a series of questions, and I would suggest that you pause at the end of this slide to think about the answers before moving on to the next slide, where I'm going to give you the answers. So let's start. Which language teaching method relied heavily on deductive grammar teaching? What does the acronym TBLT stand for? What is the key teaching activity used in the audiolingual method? What is the psychological theory behind the audiolingual method? Which language teaching method integrates 4 elements: content, communication, cognition, and culture? When was CLIL introduced in Italian secondary schools? What are some of the most typical teaching activities in communicative language teaching? And who was the main proponent of the direct method? And now let's have a look at the answers. So, language teaching method that relied heavily on deductive grammar teaching is grammar translation. As we'll see in a moment. TBLT stands for task-based language teaching. Moving on to the audiolingual method, the main teaching activity used in audiolingualism is the drill, so drills. What is the psychological theory behind this method? It's behaviorism. We're going to see that in a moment. And CLIL. CLIL is the teaching method that integrates the 4 elements of content, communication, cognition, and culture. And it was introduced in Italian secondary schools in 2010. As for the most typical teaching activities in communicative language teaching, we can talk about different activities, but typically we would talk about information gap and or role plays. And finally, the main proponent of the direct method is Maximilian Berlitz, owner of the Berlitz schools.